Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here we host a distinguished guest and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, playing for tips on a subway station platform, or else a scrappy upstart, playing for tips during your Twitch live stream, this is your show, because ultimately it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the last Friday of July and I thank you for joining us. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made, and it would always be some guy named Armando who drove a Kia Sorento with tinted windows and a stained bumper sticker on the back, and who's always trying to sell you crushed up Ritalin in sandwich baggies. And old Armando would charge you about $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. But it's the future now, you guys. That's not how it works anymore. We're allowed to have nice things now. One of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website are already built in. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music and merch commission-free. Listeners to the Working Songwriter podcast can go to bandzoogle.com to try it for free for 30 days. Use the promo code TWS, the initials of our show, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. If you'd like to hear some of my music live in the coming weeks, every Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern, every single Sunday night, I'm over on YouTube for Sunday Songs. That's a live stream. I'm live. I'm playing tunes live. I'm taking requests in the live chat. I'm taking your questions in the live chat. It's a really fun, really interactive experience. I dare to say that we're building something of a community over there on Sunday nights, including many listeners to this podcast. So come on over, be a part of it every single Sunday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, over on YouTube. Go to YouTube and search for Joe Pug, or go to joepugmusic.com and click on the live stream tab. Finally, if you enjoy this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, here's a couple things that you could do to help. First, you could become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support creative endeavors that you find meaningful. You just head to their site, Patreon, you search for The Working Songwriter, or you search for my name, and then you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month for the show. Think of it as a voluntary subscription, a subscription that you certainly don't have to pay for, but that you choose to pay for because you dig the show and you're not going to miss a few bucks at the end of the month. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in the price of a cup of coffee every month, it would make an immense difference. So thanks to everybody who's done that and who's continuing to do that. I really appreciate you. And if you're not in a place where you can contribute financially, there's still a few ways that you could help out for free. First, you could leave us a rating in the iTunes store, or second, you could simply tell a friend about the show. Spread the word about the show. The simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. Okay, I'll end all the harassment there. So the podcast is going to take a brief hiatus for the next 2 weeks because my wife and I are expecting another baby any day now, which is very exciting. So I'm going to take a little bit of paternity leave. The show will be away for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll return in force on Friday, August 20th. So thank you for your understanding, and wish me luck that this baby sleeps a little bit. Okay, I hope that you enjoy this week's episode. Our guest this week was born during World War II and spent his formative years in New Orleans. Chris Smither moved to Boston in his early 20s at the urging of legendary folk singer Eric von Schmidt. There, he found a thriving coffeehouse scene where he would hone his now signature finger-picking guitar style, a spirited combination of Mississippi John Hurt, Lightning Hopkins, and his own flair. His songs have been recorded by Bonnie Raitt, Diana Krall, and Emmylou Harris. He's toured with B.B. King, Ramblin' Jack Elliott, and many others. He's recorded with Lowell George and Dr. John. His albums have been released by Signature Sounds, Adelphi, United Artists, and High Tone Records. Perhaps his most singular accomplishment is maintaining a career in music for over 50 years. He doesn't have too many peers in that regard. Acoustic Guitar magazine says, Smither sings about the big things, life, love, loss, in a penetrating and poetic yet unpretentious way. The Associated Press authoritatively says, Smither is an American original, a product of the musical melting pot and one of the absolute best singer-songwriters in the world. I got to catch up with Mr. Smither on the phone last week and hear about his profound musical journey. Chris Smither, it's an honor to have you on the Working Songwriter Podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time. You grew up, you spent your formative years in New Orleans. Can you kind of describe what music looked like in your household and what sort of music was around you growing up?
Well, there was a fair amount of music. My parents listened to classical, but they also had a lot of folk music, or, like folk music from the 40s. We're talking Weavers and Burl Ives and things like that. And I think there was one Josh White record that I'm not sure whether I got that or whether they had that. But I just, I always sang songs. I had my records and I'd sing songs. My father's brother was a well-known musician and musicologist, and he taught me 3 chords on the ukulele, and that's basically how I got started.
Oh wow! What was his specialty in musicology? Your uncle?
Well, he was. He wrote a 4-volume piece, which has since become a standard item in music libraries, called "A History of the Oratorio" by Howard Smither, and it's actually it's one of those things like Webster's Dictionary. You just find it in every music library.
Wow, it really helps to have people in your family like that can kind of, even if it's just a few chords on a ukulele, they can kind of turn you in that direction to get you closer where you need to go. Yeah.
My parents, when I was like 8 years old, they had me taking piano lessons, and it just didn't stick, But my uncle had he just showed me, that with 3 chords you could play almost anything. Any song you knew, it was a revelation to me. I said, "Is it really that easy?" He said, "Yeah, it is." He says, and this is his famous line, which I've repeated 100 times, if not 1,000. Chris, if you know 3 chords, you can play almost any song you know, and if you know 4 chords, you can rule the world.
Well, he's not wrong, even so many years later. I think what some of our younger listeners can't really understand is now there is such an opportunity to access information, to access instruments. If you want to learn how to play the ukulele, you could learn how to play any song that you want from YouTube in 2 seconds. But, at that time, growing up when you did, you really did need somebody to literally teach you person to person to get it done.
You had to have somebody, yeah. I mean, I cannot tell you how envious I am of kids today who could, you could go, you sit there and you listen to I don't care who it is. Somebody playing and say, God, I wonder how he does that. And then you can just go to the computer and say, oh, I see. There it
I
is.
know. I know.
Laid out.
I do wonder if something is lost when you have that much information and bounty at your fingertips. If it's at a certain point, it stymies you because there's just so much information in front of you. Whereas in an earlier time, even when I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s, it was hard to get information. So when you got it, you really paid attention to the damn stuff that you got.
But yeah, you treasured it maybe a little more. It was. I see your point, but basically, I think access to information is better than no access. I still think it's better the way it is now. I understand your point. One of the things, though, that I think it does is different is that nowadays, when you can see exactly how somebody did something,
Mm-hmm.
the tendency to copy words note for note is a little bit more because you can do it, whereas in the old days there was a little more forced innovation because you could sort of you would approximate it, but in approximating techniques, and you would come up with original approaches that actually were valuable in their own right. So I don't know whether that's affected that or not, but it's one of the advantages of the old school, I think.
Yeah, totally. I think you're talking about learning by ear. So if you have something on the radio or if you tape something
Right.
from the radio, if a guitar player was playing something in, let's say, like a different tuning and you didn't know that they were in a different tuning, then you try to be figuring it out in standard. And you're right, you had to do the work of then approximating it and making it your own in standard tuning or what have you.
Oh, yeah. And it leads to complete new techniques that are completely your own, because you invented it.
Right.
in a way. I'll never forget, the first time I ever heard, the first few times that I heard slide guitar, I had no idea how they were making that noise. And I kept trying and trying to make my fingers be able to do it. Well, I wound up with a kind of a neat sliding approximation of slide guitar that I use to this day. Lots of little slides up and down the neck that sort of approximate that feel. But it's not the same thing.
How did you discover that they were using a slide? Did that blow your mind?
Saw somebody do it. I saw somebody stick a pill bottle on his finger and play. I think it was Big Snowball down in New Orleans, but at a place called the Dream Castle, which was a bar he used to play in.
Now, speaking of approximating people's styles, I think it's safe to say that some of your biggest influences on your own iconic guitar playing would be Lightning Hopkins and Mississippi John Hurt. When did you become aware of their musical output?
Let's see. It would have been my freshman year in college was when I first was exposed to Lightning Hopkins. I was originally, before I got so totally involved in music, I was actually going to be an anthropologist, and I was going to school in Mexico City, and I had a roommate down there who was from Bryan, Texas. And he was fascinated by, not so much by the fact that I was studying anthropology was at the time, but by the fact that I played guitar all the time, a lot that I hit the books. And he said, oh, you should listen to this guy, and he had a record called Blues in My Bottle. It was Lightning Hopkins. I remember it very clearly. It was on Prestige Bluesville. And I had no idea of what kind of music it was or anything. I just put it on, and to my ear, it sounded like one-man rock and roll, and I was hooked.
Yeah.
I was just totally hooked. I couldn't believe. I asked my friend, my roommate, I said, who else is playing? And he said, nobody. That's just him. I couldn't.
So how did you begin to then approximate that style? Obviously, there's no YouTube there. Did you just start trying to conjure it out of your own guitar, or did you find someone else to teach you?
No, I could figure. I sat there and listened to it enough, and I could figure out what key he was playing in.
Mm-hmm.
And then so I sort of tried to approximate. There were a few partial chords that I could use, and then I transferred from Mexico City to back to New Orleans to Tulane, and there were people at Tulane. I ran into people who could show me, because I didn't know I couldn't understand how he was making all those notes, and they said, "Oh, well, he's finger picking." And there were these guys that knew finger picking. They were from the Northeast, guys from New York, and I said, "Well, how do you do that?" And they sort of gave me a rudimentary explanation of how to finger pick guitar, and I started from there. Once I figured out what key he was playing in, and with Lightning that was pretty easy because he always played in E, and in standard tuning, and so I got into that, and of course then things were starting to happen in folk and songwriting and the whole urban blues scene about that time, and so records were becoming more available, and that was when and the next big record that really sent me over the moon was the Blues at Newport, 1963. It was a Vanguard, and that exposed me to Mississippi John Hurt. It also exposed me to people like Dave Van Ronk and Johnny Hammond and Skip James and who was the Chicago? Oh God, he never
Muddy
modulates
Waters?
either. Not Muddy, no, acoustic blues. Mojo. Let's see. Can't think. Why can't I think of his name? John. Well, it would come to me later.
Yeah.
All those guys, all those, the authentic guys, the guys that invented the music, essentially.
And you very famously then left college to kind of go be a part of this scene in the Northeast and specifically around Boston. That seems like a relatively radical thing to do. What made you alter life course so significantly at that time?
Well, at the time, I don't think I thought I was taking a break. I wasn't. I wasn't really that committed to actually changing my whole life. But I had a couple of friends in college, that were totally into this kind of music, and it was beginning to just take over my life and absorb all my attention and my waking moments. So I had a friend who was from Sarasota, Florida, also going to Tulane, and he was totally into guitar playing and the whole same sort of scene. And he said, Eric von Schmidt lives in Sarasota in the wintertime. And I said, is that right? Because I had a couple of records by von Schmidt, and of course, famously, he'd been mentioned on Bob Dylan's first record. When Bob Dylan did "Baby Let Me Follow You Down," he introduces it on the record as saying, "This is a song I learned from Rick von Schmidt." And
right.
So, he said, "Well, why don't you come on over to Sarasota with me?" Mardi Gras was coming up, and none of us were really interested in hanging around New Orleans for Mardi Gras because we'd all lived that our whole lives. So we drove over to Florida and looked up Von Schmidt's number in the phone book. He called him up, and he said, "Oh, come on over." It was kind of amazing, but in those days you could do things like that. So I went over to his house, and he couldn't have been more gracious and nicer, And his house was full of musicians. And in fact, there was a big party going on at the time, and it was half of Jim Kweskin's jug band was there. So Jeff Mulgar was there, Marie, and Fritz Richmond, all these people that were just names on album covers to me until that night. And then he says, he said, "Come on, play us a song," and I did play us a song, and everybody was very happy to listen to me, playing along. Everybody was playing instruments, and he said, "Where do you live?" And I said, "New Orleans." And he said, "Oh man," he says, "nobody's going to hear you there. You got to get up and see this scene in New York and in Cambridge. That's where it's all happening, and people would love to hear you." And to me, that was like the word of God. I had been told to go forth and multiply, and so that's what I did. And I thought, really, to tell you the truth, that it was going to be a fun summer. That I would spend, just sort of exploring this kind of music scene. And for one thing, I knew I had to get back in school, or I would be drafted. The Vietnam War was cooking along, and there was no lottery at the time. If you weren't in school, if you didn't have a student deferment, you were going to get drafted. And so it never occurred to me that I wouldn't go back to school, but that's what happened.
Yeah.
I just wound up making a living at it from the get-go.
Now, explain that, because I think it's hard for some people to understand, maybe folk musicians now, the idea that they would just move to a city and be able to make a living all of a sudden. That almost seems strange for a lot of young songwriters. So what did the scene look like on the ground in Boston, and how did you put things together?
Well, I had a little bit of money. I had maybe $400 or $500, which in 1966 was a lot more money than it is now. And I could survive. And in those days, people would always let you crash on in their living room. I lived on a lot of couches for months at a time. And I got to Boston, and I went directly to the Club 47 because that was like the object of the pilgrimage, sort of. And I got there, and actually the night that I got there, Von Schmidt was playing at the Club 47. And so, he got me. I didn't even have to pay to go in. I went in, he brought me up on stage, had me play 3 songs, and I thought, well, my fortune is made. I'm playing at the Club 47 on my first night in town. It was kind of amazing, but then I didn't play that club again for another 3 years, I don't think.
Yeah, well, there you go.
But what was interesting about being at the Club 47 was that they had flyers sitting around. There was all this information to be had, bulletin boards. You could look up and say, oh, there's all these clubs, on Charles Street down in Beacon Hill, and then I discovered the Boston Broadside, which was a weekly publication that Dave Wilson put out for years. And I started reading that, and I just started going around to these clubs and auditioning, essentially, and everybody liked what I did, So they would have, I was playing like 3 and 4 nights a week and making $15-20 a night, which in those days was pretty good money,
Yeah. So how did this turn from a long kind of blowing off some steam extended summer to a 50-year-long career? Like, at what point did you realize that this was going to be something a little bit more serious than a summer, spent in the Northeast?
Well, I discovered that with the help of a doctor that who owned a club that I was playing, I discovered that I was crazy, and I didn't have to be drafted to go into the Army. And I had a letter to prove it. And as soon as that was taken off, that kind of pressure was taken off, I realized that, it had come to me like by the end of that summer, I realized that I was, for the first time in my life, I was doing something that I absolutely loved, and I was being paid to do it. And I was happy. And so I just never stopped. I don't think it took me a long, long time, probably a couple of 3-4 years, to realize that this was what I was already doing it by the time I figured out that this was what I wanted to do.
Yes.
I was I'd already been doing it, and I realized that there was really no reason to stop. There was, that if I was careful and diligent and just went with the flow, I'd probably be okay.
I hear that. You also at that time you became running buddies with Bonnie Raitt. When did she come into your life, and how did your creative paths cross?
Yes. Well, interesting. I'd been going at it for about 5 years, and I met Bonnie. At the time that I met Bonnie, she was actually hanging with Dick Waterman. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but Dick Waterman managed and worked with a ton of the original blues men.
Mm.
He lived in Cambridge, and if you went by his house on any given day, there was no telling who would be sitting around in his living room. And Skip James, Sunhouse, Booker White, Fred McDowell, all these guys, were being managed and booked by Dick Waterman. And so you go over to Dick's house and say, let's go see who's with Dick. Anyway, they all go over there, and 2 or 3 of us. I was hanging out with songwriters and musicians, who were essentially in the same situation I was, all trying to get someplace. And Dick had this redheaded girlfriend named Bonnie, and she used to hang around and watch these guys. And it wasn't. I think I'd known Bonnie for about 3 years before I knew that she was actually a really good guitar player.
Mm.
And she played guitar at all. And then she was going to Radcliffe at the time, and she graduated from Radcliffe, a degree from Harvard.
Wow.
But she was just like me and like the rest of us. She was just getting so sucked into the music and playing very well. And of course she sings like a bird. And before you know it, she was bigger than any of us. Deservedly so.
How did you at that time, was there like a scene to tour around nationally to different clubs, or were you basically keeping it regional in and around Boston and the Northeast?
Oh, no, I was working hard to extend. I didn't get to make a record until I'd been at it for about 5 years. But, as soon as I had a record out, they were, and I had also hooked up with Manny Greenhill's Folklore Productions, this is a guy that managed a bunch of folkies in and around Cambridge, including most famously Joe Baez, but also Mimi Farina, and all the people that I've been mentioning, the Jim Kweskin Jug Band, all those people were represented by Folklore Productions, and they had to be working. It gradually started to expand, out of the Massachusetts, Northeast New England scene, and then I started getting into New York and quite a lot into Philadelphia. Philadelphia became my sort of second stronghold, and after the first record came out, I made some trips out to California. I started playing that scene a little bit, just sort of getting my feet wet, and so forth and so on.
That's a trip. And how did you like traveling? How did you like touring? Did it take it out of you, or did it energize you, or somewhere in between?
I loved it. God, it was like the answer to a dream. I couldn't believe it. I would go to these places, that I'd never been. People would show up. I would play. And they would say, "We love you." The hard life of a musician, right? No, I just, it just appealed to me. I realized in all the work I've done, over 50 something odd years now, that that's really what I enjoy doing. That's why I write the songs, is so that I can get up in front of people and say, hey, just take my trip for an hour and we'll see what we can do. And that interaction, that, you build something, and it's magical. It's the best high in the world, and it's legal.
Yeah, it's still legal after all these years. It's funny. So to you then, most of the other artistic processes, everything else is just leading up to getting to that moment of live performance.
It is, yeah.
I think I wonder, how do you think that has? How do you think that influences your songwriting then? In the sense that you're not maybe necessarily writing for the medium of a record. You're not going to be Pink Floyd in a studio for 6 months, working on a perfect, some sort of concept album. You're not going to be Tom Petty with his drummer getting the perfect snare sound for 4 months with Jimmy Iovine in the studio. Like you're trying to get through one medium to another medium, which is playing live. How do you think that has affected how you write songs?
Oh, it has everything to do with it. I think of myself, when I think of myself as a performer, I think of myself as being on stage and trying to kind of put myself in everybody's lap. I'm sitting here right close to you, and I lean over and I say to you right in your ear, come here, I'm going to tell you something.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I want to have happen. At its best, there is a feeling in the room that I'm confiding in everybody there.
Mm.
And they give it back to me. If it works, if I'm successful, they give it back to me. They confide in me too. I mean, it's really on some kind of a mystic level, but it's magic. It really is.
Have you found throughout the course of performing for people over the years that you're more able to make that magic feeling happen on a consistent basis, night to night, show to show, than at first, or do you find that you go through periods where you can make it happen and then other periods where you just don't have it?
Well, there's always going to be some nights that are better than others, but on the whole, you sort of put your finger on it. It is a learned process. You can learn how to perform. You can learn how to do it. And you have to accept that some nights you're going to be better than others, but there is a feeling that you learn how to generate. It's almost as though that we're like the fact that you can make yourself happier just by smiling.
Right.
There's a mental association with certain physical actions that actually works. And it doesn't seem very probable sometimes, but those things actually work. And the same thing applies to performance. There's some things you have to learn in performance that will make you a better performer. And one of the most important of those things is the realization that this is not an adversarial relationship.
Mm.
You don't have to conquer an audience. The audience already wants you to be good.
Yes.
and they are willing to actually support you for a certain amount of time until you find your feet. Maybe not very long. You better give them something within the first couple of songs.
Right.
At least something to hang their hopes on. But until that point comes, they're there. They're holding you up, and they will. Because they want you to be good. And once you realize that they're on your side, it becomes easier to make the good things happen.
So how do you utilize that realization that they're on your side?
It's just an overwhelming feeling that you're not facing somebody who's antagonistic. You're among friends, and that has an effect that's easily imagined. Really, you relax and you play better. You play more naturally. you get more into that feeling of that I was describing of, come here, I want to tell you something. I'm going to share something with you,
Right.
and just makes it all easier.
I talked to a comedian once, a stand-up comic, who was salty because he felt like the dynamic between a comic and an audience was adversarial. Like he comes out and everyone in the audience is kind of thinking on some basic level, let's see if you can make me laugh. And what he was salty about is that he kind of put his finger on exactly what you're talking about here. It's completely the opposite with music, where people have, in general, people come, especially with folk music, in general, people come wanting you to succeed.
Yeah. Comics have a tough road to hoe.
They do.
I mean, I've worked with many of them. Been on the same bill with them, even famous ones that everybody knows is going to give them a good time. Have a harder time than I did. I remember I did like 4 nights at the Cellar Door in Washington D.C. with Cheech and Chong, and I enjoyed it a hell of a lot more than they did. I just sat there and watched them. I mean, those guys, they work so hard and they get absolutely no guarantee that it's going to happen, even if they're at their best. Everything depends on so much on how the audience is feeling and whether they've had enough to drink. And
I know.
how we got. There's these variables, and I don't envy them in the slightest. And whereas I can get up on stage and do a little bit of comedy in between songs, and it's effortless because that's not what people actually came for. So for them, it's just a bonus if I actually say something funny, and if I don't, it doesn't ruin my show.
Are you stuck in a rut? Are you tired of listening to that Jimmy Buffett 20th Century Masters CD over and over again and need some new music? Are you sick of making hamburger helper beef stroganoff for dinner every night and you want something new to cook? What you are looking for, my friends, is the Enthusiast Digest. That's my monthly newsletter, which arrives in your inbox the first Sunday morning of every month, bursting with musical recommendations, poetry selections, recipes and cooking techniques for my favorite dishes, and items of general interest culled from the vast cesspool that is the internet. The Enthusiast Digest is free to subscribe to. If you dig the poetry that you hear on this show and the artists that you're hearing from, you'll dig the newsletter because I approach it with the exact same sensibility of curation. Go to joepugmusic.com/newsletter today to sign up for free. That is joepugmusic.com/newsletter. It takes approximately 15 seconds to sign up for a free newsletter that will enrich the first Sunday of your month with a veritable cornucopia of new and delightful recommendations. That's the Enthusiast Digest, the first Sunday of every month. Sign up for free at joepugmusic.com/newsletter. In the middle of Chris Smithers' career, he reached a crossroads with alcohol. He was going to have to take it or leave it. Thankfully, as you'll hear in this next part of our interview, he was able to leave it behind. Substance abuse is definitely an occupational hazard for working songwriters. After all, we ply our trade in bars every night, and not only that, for us, the drinks are on the house. You're not only expected to drink, you're encouraged. And you're surrounded by a culture where it's completely normal to have your first round at beer 30 and go all the way to last call. So, a dependence on alcohol can really sneak up on you. You never think it's going to be you that has the problem, and it's a hard pill to swallow when it finally dawns on you. There's a wonderful poem by Tom Slay about that awful realization that none of us are exempt from life's suffering. It's entitled, "The Animals in the Zoo Don't Seem Worried." Looking at the lion behind the plate glass, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. A lion, okay, but he seemed to come apart. Not literally, I mean, but I couldn't see him whole. Mane, teeth, the slung belly pumping as he panted and began to roar. His balls sheathed in fur, swaying a little. His tail's tuft jerking in an arc like an old-time pump handle rusted in midair. Somebody or something I read once said that when Jesus had his vision of what his Father God would do to him, that Jesus could only see pieces of a cross, pieces of a body appearing through flashes of sun, as if the body in his vision was hands looking for feet, a head for a torso, everything come unmagnetized from the soul. The lion caught me in his stare, not at or through me, but fixated on the great chain of being that Jesus couldn't see and that a zebra might gallop in. Black and white stripes marking longitudes of this world turning to meat, bloody meat. This vision of an inmate that Jesus' Father helped to orchestrate by making a cageless cage with glass instead of bars, though the lion didn't seem to care. He was roaring for his keepers to bring him food, so everything's what it should be if you're a lion. Nor did the sea lion seem concerned about having gone a little crazy, barking incessantly so I could see the plush, hot pink insides of its throat. Though, like the lion through the glass, there's this distortion. My reflection I'm looking through that makes me float above the zoo. And now this silence at closing time pours like a waterfall in different time zone of silences that, pouring through my head, surround roaring, barking, human muttering. Is any of that what being sounds like? Or is it just animal gasping like what Jesus must have heard from the thieves hanging beside him, one damned, one saved? What was in his heart when his vision clarified and he saw it was a hand he recognized that the nail was driving through? So let me ask you this. I've read that, after your initial start, you hit the road a little bit. You got out of the regional scene in Boston, and you're playing and you're doing your thing. I've heard that kind of you had a middle period in your career where things kind of slowed down for you a little bit. I read in your biography, you said, I was basically drunk for 12 years, and somehow I managed to climb out of it, and I don't know why. Can you kind of, I know I'm a songwriter myself. I've spent a lot of time, I spent my whole late 20s and early 30s working in bars, dancing with the muse that is alcohol. It's a really tough thing in our line of work. Can you kind of describe your relationship with that side of the business and how it changed for you at that time?
Well, it was the whole business of alcohol and well, any drug for that matter, was a question of, it has an insidious nature for some people. Alcohol, it can be so much your friend in the beginning, and then gradually it kind of takes over and becomes something you have to have. I mean, it's like any other addiction. I don't really like to over romanticize it or over dramatize it in any way. Just it was a natural part of my life. Both my parents drank, but the amount that they drank wouldn't have even got me off the launching pad. I mean, they would have a cocktail every night, but that would be it,
Right.
And to me, that would just be the start. Although that's the way I started drinking, just a little bit, and there was a whole long period when I would have much rather smoke pot
Right.
than drink alcohol. And then gradually, I realized it got to the point where every time I smoked pot, it made me worry about my drinking. Fix this, I'll quit smoking pot. That was my answer to my alcohol problem, was to quit smoking pot, so I didn't think about it. Alcohol, that's the drug that I know the most about, having lived through it. It's a losing game, you just keep losing and losing and losing, and people lose confidence in you too. It gets to the point where people say, there's something wrong with Chris. I'm not really sure I go that road, and they may not even figure out exactly what it is. They just know something's wrong, and other people do know exactly what's wrong, but they don't say anything to you. And, whether you get out of it or not sort of depends on how much you are capable of losing before you say enough is enough. Now, for some people, their very lives are simply their last negotiable asset, and those people will drink themselves to death.
Right.
And other people quit. The losing gets too much to take long before that, and so they get off light. And then there's people like me who are probably someplace in the middle. I lost a lot, but eventually, I get to the point where I got to get out of this. I got to get out of this, and it has absolutely nothing to do with being smart or being good or virtuous. It's just the way you're built, I think. I have no idea why it worked for me to get out, and why I recovered from that particular disease. I just know that it has nothing to do with being good or virtuous. It's just, if I were a Christian, I'd call it grace, but I'm not, so I don't know what to call it.
Yeah, that what you're describing there pretty much lines up perfectly with what just sounds like grace of God, someone from a Christian perspective would say. Right. It's funny. I think that has then allowed you to have this this career in music that's been really peerless, because you've been putting out records for so long, and in my opinion, they keep on. Like, I'm a huge fan of your later work. That's how I came to it. And what's interesting to me, I thought it was so funny. I first heard "Leave the Light On" for the first time, let's say, 10 years ago, and when I fell in love with the song. And I just thought how funny it was. I'm like, here's a fella who's had a career for 40 years up until now, and I became a fan of his today. You know what I mean? Like, it's an amazing thing that you've built. How were you not only able to keep this going for so long and doing it, but how did you remain creative where you could make a work of art like that 40 years in? You didn't get bored. You didn't get jaded. You were able to still create something at that point in your career that was still like vital and searching and interesting.
I just kept looking, and a part of it has to do with what we discussed before, is the fact that I wanted to be able to still get up in front of people, and at some point you've got to come up with new material, or you can't play the same old songs. And of course, the another aspect of it, one aspect of coming up with new material is paying attention to your life and letting new information come in. Read a lot of books, read a lot of poetry, get some ideas, figure out how to synthesize that into your basic philosophy of life. And that's what really makes a song interesting, where you can take some specific kind of knowledge and say, what, on a larger scale, that expands to explain a whole lot of why people are happy or why they're not unhappy or why they're unhappy. And then if you can make that rhyme, you've got people can relate to, people come up and they listen to my songs, and God bless them. They'll come up and say, you've been writing the story of my life for the last 30 years. and I go, but it's the story of my life, and it's really the story of everybody's life. And I've been lucky enough to get through the bad times, and come out happier in the end. And one would hope with a little bit of self-realization and self-knowledge. And you try to spread that around and say, okay, here's what it consists of, or here's what I think it consists of. See what you think, which is even more appealing to most people. They can say, well, here's something that worked for me.
Yeah, and it sounds like another reason you've been able to continue having this conversation with an audience is because you are writing in that way, and you have an audience there to support you. They want to know what the next chapter is in the book that you're writing about their life.
Exactly, and that's another thing that keeps me writing is the desire not to disappoint.
Something very similar drives me, but it's more of the fear of disappointing others rather than the desire, the abject fear of.
Well, there's an element of that too. I can relate to that.
How do you conceive of your relationship with your audience? I'm sure it's changed over the years. When you first started your career, entertainment in general, especially music, there would be a lot of mystery put around artists, and maybe you wouldn't necessarily see them before or after shows. And now everyone is as accessible as an Instagram direct message or a Facebook direct message or whatever. How have you watched that relationship between artists and fans change over the years, and how has it changed for you specifically?
I would say that for me, it really hasn't changed, because I always tried to avoid that from the get-go. I never liked that sort of artificial separation. I always tried to be out there and actually, talk to people. And my whole performance style is one of casual conversation. And, I don't like that kind of artificial barrier between the audience and the performance where they're viewing it. I like the audience to feel that they're a part of it, and they are a part of it. At least in the kind of music that I play, they have a very important role to play. One of the reasons that I love playing in Ireland so much is that the Irish really understand that. They know that they have a role to play, and they get every ounce out of you that they can. They because what you're doing is you're creating this thing, this intangible thing that exists as long as you're up there and the audience is there, and it depends on both of you for it to exist. And then as soon as the show's over, it fades away.
Yes.
And then you have to recreate it every night, which is where we get the word recreation. I guess recreation has to be done over and over again. So in a way, I feel like, and now that I think about it, the Grateful Dead had the idea. They had it right from the beginning, when they started letting people make recordings and become intimately involved in what the band was doing. They never sold millions and millions and millions of records. They never did. But they always had tens of thousands of people coming to their shows.
Right.
Over and over and over again. Most successful touring band in the world for, year after year. And that was why. It was because they didn't make that artificial, that wall between them and the people.
It's funny, and now even the people who did like that artificial boundary, they've had to come around, because that's not how audiences expect to consume art anymore at all. Like they do want and demand that accessibility.
Right, they do. And I can see it gets a little tricky, because you do have to maintain a private life. I mean, you don't want people showing up in your driveway expecting to have dinner with you.
Sure.
but at the same time, there has to be an impression that you could do that if you wanted to.
Right. Well, I'm sure everyone listening to this right now does wish they could come to your driveway and have dinner with you, and because this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for being a part of the Working Songwriter Podcast. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're entirely welcome. It's fun to talk to you.
This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Chris Smithers' latest album is entitled More from the Levee, available at smither.com. If before we meet again you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.